Hi, this is the second lecture for Chapter 2, Writing in Psychology. Here we're going to move into our third learning outcome from this list. We're going to define and explain the purpose of key research concepts that characterize typical psychological research. So I'm going to take you through a short discussion of the scientific method, and we'll get to things like hypothesis and operational definition. And then we'll talk about the different parts of a psychology manuscript so that you can take one apart in order to figure out exactly what's in it. What we're really trying to get at here is reading a document in a way that enables you to fully comprehend what's in it. You need to understand the document, not just have read it once. It's not like the way I used to read in middle school, where I'd just sort of let my eyes go over the page, and then by the time I was done, I'd be like, I read it, and I could sort of tell you the gist, but not all the details. We have to read for comprehension now. We have to practically study these articles. And in order to do that, in order to fully understand our sources, we need to know the parts of manuscripts as they're typically constructed, so that we can begin to link our sources together in a conceptual way. Psychologists would say semantically link them. In other words, link them based around meanings. So to do that, we should talk a little bit about the scientific method. Seek this out elsewhere, by the way, if you haven't seen it already. I believe it appears in the textbook, the APA handbook. But it is a cyclical system, this method, in which scientists start with some germination of an idea. And we've already talked about how those can come from different places. You can think about making a literal observation when walking around day to day, or you could think about it as making an observation in the literature. We talked about those systematic and less systematic methods of inspiration for research ideas. But anyway, you start with an observation right at the top, which drives you to ask a question. That is the center of any beginning of any scientific enterprise, a question. And in order to try to answer the question, we should first form a hypothetical answer, a hypothesis, what we think the answer to the question is. And we'll come up with that hypothesized answer based on things we already know, either from observing the world or from reading the literature surrounding the question we've generated. Then we'll collect evidence to test our hypothesis. Hopefully we've generated a falsifiable, well-stated, clear, precise hypothesis such that it is relatively easy to test because it would be relatively easy to disprove. And so then once we have our evidence, we will analyze the results, the data that come from our participants in most cases, and then we'll draw some conclusions. We'll decide whether our hypothesis was correct or not, and we'll use the data to more fully inform the answer to our question. And then it starts all over again, because usually the theoretical conclusions you draw from one single study can also serve to bring up many new questions for many imagined follow-up studies. And so the observations continue in a cyclical way, recreating themselves and sort of developing into a large-scale scientific goal set, scientific question set, a meta method, if you will. Manuscripts are structured to get at most of these parts of the scientific method. It'll typically start with the research question. It'll hopefully give you an idea of whether, if it's well written, it will give you an idea of whether the question is descriptive or causal. And so these are two important types of research questions. A descriptive research question is one that asks how one construct relates to some other construct. Are these two things related at all? Do they happen anywhere near each other? Can we collect evidence of that? You could alternatively ask a causal research question, which is a little bit more precise, in which you would ask how one construct affects another construct. So again, that's a more specific question. It's a question that's easier to disprove any answer to, because if you say how one affects the other. It either could affect it some other way or could just be related and not actually affect it at all. Lots of ways that can go wrong. So that might be maybe a more robust research question, according to our Karl Popper-based theories from a recent video. Then you should be able to find their hypothesis, some kind of statement that uses specific definitions of the constructs that they're trying to investigate, that will sort of give you their, again, hypothesized answer to their research question. And as always, that should be a falsifiable hypothesis. Then you should see a description of their research methodology, followed by a description of their results, followed in the end by some statement about why we should care. And so you can take these pieces of a manuscript and actually pull them all out and turn that pretty directly into a summary of what happened in that manuscript. Once you get really good at this, you can work on doing each of these in a single sentence, but it can sometimes be tough to do that right at first. And so I recommend trying to keep it to at least a couple sentences per item here. So you're talking about like a 10 to 15 sentence summary. If you can get it down further than that, that's probably worth doing. But you got to make sure that you capture all the necessary details. So you need, yes, a general description of the research methodology, but you don't want to leave anything out. And yes, you can sort of generally describe the results, especially at this point when you haven't taken research methods and stats yet, but you should at least give the reader of your document a clear idea of whether the hypothesis was correct or not, whether it was falsified. And then definitely always get back into the big picture, telling us about what this particular answer to this research question means, extending beyond the immediate audience of scientists. Let's dig into each of these in a little bit more detail. The introduction will typically start with big picture type statements in which they will talk about the constructs at play. I already used these two terms, construct and operational definition, kind of without defining them, sorry, so here's the definitions now. A construct is the big picture idea that the investigators, that the researchers are trying to dig into here. So they are typically seeking to define some construct, be it memory, be it a specific type of memory, eyewitness memory, eyewitness identification memory, confidence in eyewitness identification memory. There is a hugely wide variety of constructs in psychology, from those within cognitive to social to developmental and everywhere else. And that is typically the idea you'll get from the abstract of the paper or the very first parts of the introduction. They'll tell you the construct that they're dealing with, the psychological concept, the faculty of the mind that they're interested in for this paper. And that's good to know. But you cannot survive on constructs alone. You also have to find out how they're going to specifically define that construct within the scope of this paper. Because if you have, let's say, a construct like love, it's going to be really difficult to define that exactly the same way as every other researcher has before you. So you're going to need to develop what we call an operational definition. So this is an objective, hopefully pre-tested definition of a construct. It'll usually appear somewhere in your methods section. And in my love example, let's say I've developed a measure in which people rate their feelings for their partner on a scale of 1 to 7 for 30 questions, and I can tell them how in love they are with their partner by the end. And I've done 10 studies with it before, so it's it's reliable, it's valid. I've got all the bona fides accounted for. So then we'd have what sounds like a pretty darn good operational definition of the construct of love. And so the way an introduction section generally moves is going to be taking you from that construct down into their specific operational definition over the course of a few paragraphs, because when it finishes, you'll move right into their method section. With that in mind, their intro will probably finish with a hypothesis or several hypotheses that combine the construct and they might refer to the construct or they might refer to the operational definition. It depends on the paper. Both are fine. If it's a descriptive hypothesis, or a descriptive research question, then we again are talking about how two constructs are related. And so we might talk about the presence or absence of one or another, the frequency with which they appear, or the many varieties of relationships they could possibly have, one of which is causal. Remember, that's investigations into how constructs affect other constructs, in which case you're definitely going to be looking at experimental methodology. That is methodology in which certain variables are manipulated while all the others are held constant. You can sometimes even find the big research question and the relevant constructs to it in the title and the very first few sentences of a paper. So here's just a couple examples. We've got the scientific status of learning styles theories. We know the construct they're dealing with. It's going to be learning styles. Second one here, learning styles also appear. So this fits in with the examples I was giving you in a recent video. And then as you dig in, you'll see operational definitions in like the methods and the figures. So this is going further into those same two papers. If you go ahead and grab those papers, you'll see that it moves in this direction. Once we get to the end of the intro, we get into their methods, we start to see the operational definitions of learning styles as they define them. So then in that method section, there are usually 3 subsections. They're not always labeled and titled, but they do always appear. The method section will always tell you about the participants, the materials, and the design and procedure. In the participants section, they'll tell you how many people participated in the study, how many research subjects they had. They'll tell you about those people, the characteristics of them, the demographics of them, where they got them from, how much they paid them. And then they'll tell you if they recruited a specific group of people and if they had any criteria for removing people from the sample after their data had been collected. A really common version of this in the research that I do is that we will remove people who seem like they didn't pay attention. So we'll have like a couple of sneaky little attention check questions in the middle of a survey to make sure the person is still watching and carefully and answering the questions thoughtfully, and they'll be excluded if they don't. So that's what I mean by exclusionary criteria. Then the method section will move into a materials and apparatus subsection, in which they'll tell you things like what instruments did they use, what surveys did they give out, what exactly was their test like, how did they ask people to memorize, did they measure heart rate, did they measure fMRI, did they measure EEG, are we looking at people's self-reports of their memories, people's reports of their personality traits, stories from the past, what kind of data should we expect to get out of this basically. Or the other photo on here is eye tracking. Then it'll move into design and procedure, in which they'll give you some of the nitty-gritty, the specifics. They'll tell you whether, you'll see again here whether we're talking about a descriptive or causal research question, because they should tell you about the experimental procedure, in this case, the experimental design, if it's there, and if that's the case, then we're looking at a causal question. They'll tell you if people were separated into groups, and if so, how they were assigned to those groups. They'll tell you the order of the events, so this will be really specific stuff. The design and procedure section should enable another researcher, really all the sections of the method section, should enable another researcher to repeat your procedure exactly. So that's the maybe most crucial part of this subsection especially, is that it needs to be repeatable. It should be so clear and so detailed that another researcher could read it and then go do your study exactly as you did. It's tough to do. Then you'll move into the results section, in which you'll see statistics, graphs, and the goal is to try to connect what you see back to the hypotheses that the paper presented earlier on. This is your goal as a reader. So you should look through look through the stats, look through the graphs, pull out whatever you can to see whether you can come up with an answer to the research question based on the data. These are just a couple of random things just to show you that you'll see figures and tables. If you see figures like this and tables like this, what you're probably looking at is a correlational study, and very likely you're looking at a descriptive research question. Whereas if you have figures and tables that look like these, you're more likely dealing with an experiment, a causal research question, and thus a causal response, a causal answer to that question. So keep all those things in mind. And then you'll come to the final section, usually called discussion. Sometimes there will be like a conclusions subsection as well. And the goal here is to tell the reader, who cares? Why should we care about reading any of this? Why should we care about telling anyone else about this? And the goal is to describe to the reader in good, clear detail how the observation from the experiment enables us to generalize back to the theory itself, which then gives us predictions about future experiments and future possible observations. So I hope this is helpful. This video sort of taking you through how to read an empirical article in psychology, or potentially a meta-analysis in psychology as well. We'll continue to work on issues like these in the coming weeks. Thanks.